Hello, everybody. This is Philosophy 60, the first lecture that will be put up on either Sunday night or Monday evening. I think that Sunday night will be the regular process here, and I hope this is very helpful. I'm going to spend the first lecture kind of reviewing where we've been for the semester and where we're going from here. And I will, of course, be providing this link to YouTube of this recording. Um, First of all, I'd like to say, I think that this reading of the syllabus, which I think is our game plan, if you will, in sports language, or our flight plan, our itinerary for the semester, is very important to keep following and reflecting upon. It is an act in which I need to keep referring to, and it will keep you oriented during the semester with some very, high-powered material and the readings and the thematics we're engaging. So please review that syllabus. As you know, it's on Blackboard, and we'll be engaging everything on it in the course of the semester. I want to do as uh, excellent a job as possible as we go forward with both these little introductions to the readings for the week, as well as the following of the syllabus and keeping you very grounded in the thought processes for the semester. Okay, so number one, I would like to first of all go back and talk a little bit about the course's direction. We began on September the 9th, a Thursday, and I introduced the course, the syllabus. As you know, we were in person, which was okay, but I obviously did not like the room, the non-ventilation, tried to change it, but to no avail. And I think we're basically doing the right thing for our health for right now. And hopefully we'll be back to quote unquote normal in person without masks coming the next semester. But for right now, I think this is the best approach. So we began with the study of philosophy by Antonio Gramsci. Why study philosophy? Um, and I mentioned to you that Gramsci wrote notebooks in prison, and this is a very small part of the prison notebooks. And my orientation here in trying to get you interested in philosophy is that all of us in varying degrees are philosophers by definition, according to Antonio Gramsci, and also Louis Althusser, our other reading that we have been engaging in this month of September, going into our first class in October. For Gramsci, this notion of spontaneous philosophy is common to all of us. I'm repeating myself, but please bear with me because I want you to get this. Spontaneous philosophy is composed of three elements, right? The elements are language, which is a determined totality of notions and concepts. We do not think about words isolated from their meaning or from their context. We need a determined totality, he speaks of. So this is very important to keep in mind, and that we all share language. And if you notice in note number 3, he speaks of language in terms of dialect and the shaping of worldviews, national language and international language. So there's a connection between the first page of the notebook and, of course, note number 3, which is on the third page of the notebook, or our readings, pages 626, I think, through 656. So after establishing that element, Gramsci goes on to speak about common sense. And common sense is what we're all trapped in, according to Gramsci. We live by common sense, how ideas have been socialized in our various communities and our families by reinforcements from the state, reinforcements in everyday life, media, etc., worlds of advertising, how all of this is building up in us some kind of very conventional and ultimately conformist behavior. And he wants us to break out of this, knowing how hard it is. It's very difficult to do. We have to engage in some conformist thinking, vis-a-vis the rules, vis-a-vis norms of a given community, etc. But again, he's encouraging us to think outside the box. So he comes up with a term called good sense, which kind of confronts common sense in a way that begins to say that common sense in religion, which is an offshoot, if you will, or a fragment of common sense that's kind of broken off from this establishment of conformity and behavioral norms, how this in some ways is a thinking inside the box, and he wants us to think outside of the box. So he comes up with a term, and again, a key word, ideology. And ideology allows us, when we begin to think in terms of systems of representations and how ideas become socialized and immersed and dominant in a culture, allows us to see through, what's actually going on. So you have kind of ideologies, that work in advertisement, that work in all phases of life. The educational ideology to me is preparedness for job readiness, that you're being prepared for a job. In other words, instead of really being educated, learning how to critically think, I've been using the term brain capital versus that of diploma mill or just the diploma, and going through the motions. So this is another aspect of Gramsci that's very important to think about. So I want you to understand these two elements very carefully. Language, which reveals worldviews. You can basically, for Gramsci, locate a person's politics, their ethics, the ethos that they inhabit by analyzing the language that they use. That it has been shaping their worldview and reveals their worldview simultaneously. And that, the task is to get out of just dialect or out of language of the hood or just vernacular and begin to see a higher level of language being used and engage in processes of articulation. That's one way of getting outside of it. Secondly, this notion of common sense, which is crucial to understand. And one way we do that is we begin to become critically self-aware, which is note 1 on the beginning of the elements in the reading. So the third, of course, is folklore, of which religion is very important. Gramsci, in some ways agrees with Marx's statement that religion is the opiate of the people. We will discuss that a little more actively. Althusser, certainly in his reading, has a section on philosophy and religion, which we'll be discussing this week. I hope you're reading that. I'm going to try to go there again in the summation next week, but also in the class for both Tuesday and Thursday, to Althusser's notion of philosophy and its relationship to religion and how it comes in. It's a little different than Gramsci. Okay, so we have these three elements that play out, and as I mentioned and diagrammed on the board multiple times, that there's an experience of time and an experience of everyday life that takes place in this spontaneous philosophy, which is sometimes fragmented, unconscious, mechanical. It's determined by external environment, not determined internally, if you will. It's also very commonplace, conformist in terms of behavior, and you don't see yourself as really having an active role in the world. It's more of passive resignation in the spontaneous philosophy, because you have not been introduced yet to the struggle towards the philosophy of praxis, which is Gramsci's point. Why to study philosophy is to get yourself to the point of becoming an active participant in both learning subjectively and being able to place that into a more objective historical situation, to understand your role, how you've been made by the society and the societal relations that have helped to shape you, how ideology permeates a lot of your daily life. Again, this is very important to remember in this sense. So the key words here, the concept of spontaneous philosophy, Common sense, which is one of its basic elements, is certainly key as the nucleus of where the struggle takes place. And then thirdly, of course, the notion of the back and forth of religion. And then the first definitions of philosophy that he engages is that it establishes some kind of intellectual order. So philosophy begins to give us why to study philosophy, why to engage it, is that it gives us some types of intellectual order. It begins to give us some kind of system of thinking, right? That we can think in an organized fashion and be able to look back on some of our experiences and how we're shaped critically with critical self-awareness in one level, but also critically in terms of the historical circumstances we find ourselves in, with the ability to actively change things. And as I've mentioned to you, as a parallel to this, we have the ability of or the notion of reading as interpretation, active interpretation, understanding, an act of understanding, and then reading as an act of transformation. Gramsci is going on those three levels always. So anyway, as I did on the diagram, the philosophy of praxis begins to orient us towards a higher conception of life. It's antithetical to the, passivity of Jesuitism, which is a philosophical movement. It's a teacher's movement that's provided by the church, right, in order to control the masses, to educate, but to control. Education as control, not education as liberation, which is what Gramsci sees the promise of Marxism to be so. And that's open to question, but really in a way, the Marxism is a kind of critique, a critical philosophy, a critical approach to, how we're made and how we can change. So this is a philosophy of transformation and a philosophy of change. So it's very important to keep in mind as we go forward. So I hope this helps some of the understanding of Gramsci. Once again, I think that we have a lot to engage going forward with Gramsci as we proceed. We're going to be looking back at his work and thinking about this more, about how ideas become socialized during historical period. So we'll speak of that in the ancient world with Plato, and also in Althusser's sense of the moment of practice in his coursework that he gave in 1979, going to Louis Althusser. So the second book, and I'm putting it up here again, Philosophy for Non-Philosophers, is a course book, right? Louis Althusser is trying to introduce students who are not either what we call majors or going to be professional philosophers to the practice and thinking of philosophy. So Althusser begins with some definitions, what non-philosophers say. And this is pages 18 through 44, the first part of this course. You could think of it as a beginning, of the lectures. And, he says what makes philosophy in a way is a very long detour. You're really outside of the box completely. You live in a world apart, So in some ways, the task in, say, a course like this is to try to put yourself outside of the other, learning you're doing in classes. This is not memory work. This is work that requires working through concepts, working through ideas, and understanding the power of ideas. And he also speaks about patience as a philosophical virtue or as an excellence, to have the patience, that philosophy is not the quick fix. It is not an intervention that quickly fixes something. It's a much more long take, if you will, like in cinema language, of a reflection on reality and what we can do in terms of interpreting it, again, understanding it and transforming it. Althusser speaks about three practices in reading. He says interpretation, interrogation, and this is important, building the task of questioning that path. And we're going to see that path of questioning, if you follow me, in Plato, especially with the Socratic method and the Socratic dialogues, right? When we get to Plato, I'll introduce Plato as well tonight a little bit. Okay, so what philosophy does for Althusser is that, you keep going back over texts infinitely, interminably, he uses. You keep rereading and rereading to think this through. So for example, myself, I'm going to reread Plato's Meno for maybe about the 8th to 9th time, and I'll probably, hopefully, see some new things or new ways of approaching it. So philosophy forces us to reread, to rethink. And this is what he's really trying to get. And also that philosophy is always contemporary. So we're going to be still, when we read something from 2,500 years ago, the thematic of what is excellence remains. How do we set standards in the society? How do we do that? Is grade a measure of success in a class, or is it something else, right? How do we really measure this notion of successfulness, or change for that matter, or stasis, staying the same versus that of being dynamic in our approach? So these are very, very good questions that he raises, and the question of that, of encouraging productive exchanges. And I hope we can do this during the course of the semester on Zoom, where we do see each other, at least in these little mirrors, monads, and we don't have masks on, and we can really hopefully have some philosophical dialogue, going forward. And again, as an aside, I want to offer again the office hour, the one-on-one encounters with me to make sure that you're doing well. Okay, so let me go back over the Althusser. I'm going to highlight a couple of things. Of course, this question of idealism and materialism, the idealist and the materialist practice of philosophy, this begins on page 22, to how to take the big detour. And on page 23, he begins to define the idealism, etc. The idealist philosophers, excuse me, speak on everyone's behalf and in everyone's stead. They think and make no mistake that they possess the truth. So for Althusser, the idealists really think they're moving towards the truth always, right? The materialist philosophers, on the other hand, are much less talkative. They know how to shut up and listen to people, be quiet, right? And listen actively to people. They do not consider themselves privy to the truth about everything. They know they can only become philosophers gradually, with modesty, and that philosophy will come to them from the outside. So they begin to be quiet, reflective, and they listen actively. That's the first distinction he draws between idealism and materialism. And this is going on page 23 of the text. We need not go very far in terms of what we hear to observe that there exists among the people, among workers who haven't received any philosophical education, or yourselves for that matter, students that are taking philosophy for the first time, and never had a master whom they could follow in the act of philosophizing, a certain idea of philosophy precise enough for us to be able to refer to it and discuss it. That plainly means, as the materialists claim, everyone is a philosopher. So he's echoing and repeating, if you will, Antonio Gramsci. Even if the philosophy he carries around in his head is, as one can imagine, not exactly the philosophy of the great philosophers. Not everyone's a Rene Descartes when they, start to begin to philosophize or have a philosophy. So he gives many examples of this on page 23, 24. And again, what I would like you to take away from this is about the idealist really thinks they're in possession of the truth or going towards the truth, and they don't really listen as actively as the materialist, who is trying to understand, right, where someone is and work with that, and also knows that you would need the patience of philosophy coming to you, right, in some ways. And he uses the notion on page 24, a concept called philosophical stock. And this is important to remember as well. Instead of common sense, he uses common philosophical stock, right? People go in their different ways and their different ideas, right? And set up norms that way. So at the end, of course, then he speaks about, and I mentioned this in class last week, and I want you to take this up. Again, activity then, but passive activity, but resigned activity is what happens in most of the idealist capacity, whereas in the materialist, there's an active transformation going on, right? And then I'm going to read the last paragraph of the first section. I am simply summarizing the thought of the Italian Marxist philosopher Gramsci. You can see how materialist philosopher reasons. He doesn't tell himself stories. He doesn't begin narratives. He doesn't make lofty speeches. He doesn't say that everyone is a revolutionary. He lets people talk and he tells things the way they are. There is no denying the fact in the broad masses of people who have not yet been awakened to the struggle, or even in the case of those who have fought but were defeated, there's an underlying resignation. So Althusser, again, is broadening philosophy out into the world, that it becomes an active force in the world, and that we have to learn from that in terms of both defeat and go beyond that of resigned, passivity, really, in a way, just acceptance. And we'll talk more about this as we get into Plato and the Greeks. It goes back to the earliest periods of history, which have been the histories of class societies of exploitation and oppression. Men of the people, shaped by their history, may have revolted, but since their revolts were put down, they had no choice but to resign themselves to the necessity to which they were subjected and accepted philosophical. And then he ends, this is where religion comes in, kind of making a nice transition to the notion and the concept of resignation and its relationship to religion, and how maybe how Plato, again, partakes in this early formation of religion by a resigned kind of idealism, and also that, what dominates in religion is this kind of resigned passivity in a way, and sometimes resigned activity. And we'll talk about this vis-a-vis the examples of the Black church, civil rights movements, etc. On page 29, he mentions the philosopher Epicurus. This is the first materialist philosopher, full-out materialist thing. The philosophy of Epicurus does not speak about the origin of the world, which is a meaningless question. How did it all get started? But the beginning of the world. So this is very important to keep in mind. It doesn't bring the omnipotence of God into play to draw out the world of nothingness. God does not create the world, right? Before the beginning, there's neither God nor nothingness. What is there then? There is, materialist thesis par excellence, always already something, always already matter. So this is the beginning, always already matter for the materialist, which is not chaos. It is matter, subject to certain laws. What is this matter? And he goes on to define this, and this is very crucial, page 29. What is this matter? It is an infinite number of atoms, indivisible particles, all falling into the infinite void as a result, without effect of gravity or law, falling side by side without ever encountering one another. And then he goes on to another figure, and I'll speak about these two figures this week a little bit alongside Plato. Epicurus, who was known as the garden philosopher, one of the four schools of philosophy back in ancient times, and I'll go through the Academy, the Peripatetic schools, the Stoa, and then, of course, the Garden of Epicurus. These are the four schools in ancient Athens. If you would go to school for philosophy, if you want to think about this, am I going to the Academy? Am I going to the Stoa? Am I going to the Lyceum Peripatetic with Aristotle? Or am I going to go to the Garden with Epicurus? So we'll speak more about this, but this is a very crucial passage, page 29 and 30, on materialism and its encounter with religion. So I would like you to look at this carefully. I don't want to, make the first lecture too long here tonight, introduction to philosophy and philosophy for non-philosophers, because I want to just make a mention about Meno, which we will be engaging in class this week too. And we're going to be going into the Platonic dialogues. And I want to repeat, we have multiple forms of reading here and styles of presentation, types of genre and writing. We have notebooks from prison with Gramsci. We have a course from Althusser. Now we're going to a dialogue that Plato wrote in the 4th century BCE in Athens, right? And we're reading two of those dialogues, the Meno and the Apology. So anyway, to return then in a way, page 31, philosophy, descended of religion, took up religion's questions again. It must not be supposed that it did so to be prudent, because for a century there was a prohibition on thinking. And this is interesting, this prohibition on thinking. Are we going through that same thing now? You know, we're just doing and not really thinking outside of religion. You have to think in religious terms or think in the terms of the system. And again, I mentioned the Tina syndrome here. To not be able to think outside. Is there an alternative to advanced late capitalism, or whatever term we want to use? Some people are now using hyper-industrial society, et cetera, to describe the era we live in. Some other people, the digital age. Some other people call it the Anthropocene, capital scene, and then the negantropy scene. So we'll talk about these concepts as well as we go forward. But, you know, what is prohibited to think outside the box, and the censorship. And we've talked a lot about that in terms of curriculums in schools. So this is a very important passage, 231, 32, and the questions of religion. And then he tries to define religion on pages 32, 33, and we'll go over that. So more activity of mind, more focus is placed on the relationship of philosophy and religion in Althusser than in Gramsci. So that's maybe an advance, or at least a way of questioning differently. Okay, and then the beginnings of philosophy, page 39. So he goes on the philosophy of the philosophers, and he talks about the origin of philosophy was not just contention between differing viewpoints, but it was an abstraction. The practice of Greek geometry. This is at the bottom of page 39. So geometry and the geometer is the beginning of philosophy, thinking about how does one measure the earth? How does one come to measure this? How does one understand these mathematical principles of the geosphere? And remember, at this time, the earth is still the center of the universe when Plato begins to dwell on this, as well as Aristotle, in terms of both time and space. All right, so we'll speak about that. And then page 41, what did Plato do? He came up with the unheard project of restoring the unity of the dominant ideas undermined by the advent of mathematics, not by combating mathematics in the name of religion, nor by contesting its methods or results, but quite the contrary, by acknowledging their existence, their validity, and borrowing from them the novelty that they had introduced, the idea of pure objects to which only pure reasoning can be applied. So this is the beginning of philosophical abstraction. This is why I had the famous sentence engraved on the lintel of the School of Philosophy: let no one who is not a geometer enter here. Yet the same Plato, who had apparently gone to school to mathematics, or on mathematics, conducted the whole operation for the sole purpose of making mathematics go to school to his philosophy. So he put mathematics not in first place, but in second to his philosophy, after philosophy. He thereby managed, by subordinating mathematics to his philosophy, to gain control over it, or in other words, to put it back in the place of the established order. This order, that of the moral and political values that mathematics had momentarily threatened or might threaten. Thus, he beat back the threat that the discovery of mathematics represented for the dominant ideas of his day. So this is a very interesting section on the political ideological level of the beginning of the idealist tradition, best represented by Plato in the history of philosophy. So please read these sections carefully too. Okay, I'm going to go on for a few more minutes just about introducing Plato's dialogue. So of course, we've gone from Gramsci's notebooks on the study of philosophy written in prison, the 30-odd pages we read of those notebooks, written in probably around 1931, The notebooks were smuggled out by his sister-in-law. They ended up in London and then in the hands of a man named Togliatti, head of the Communist Party, and then remade, reordered, and put out in book form and disseminated after World War II. Althusser, on the other hand, is writing this course in philosophy after many years of teaching, many years of reflection and patience, in 1979. Now we're going back in time, at least in terms of the linear history of time, right, and durational time, calandrial time, back to the 4th century BCE of the ancient Greeks. And one of the great masters of philosophy, maybe the founding member of the philosophical systematic community in which all the issues were raised. A Scottish philosopher named Alfred North Whitehead mentioned that all of philosophy is a footnote to Plato's thought. That can be taken in many ways and can be interpreted in many ways, but it is a valuable saying. The whole of philosophy is but a footnote to Plato, a long footnote. So anyway, I want to go over this. You should have read at least part of this, the introduction. The questioning here in the Meno to introduce this is called an early dialogue. It's part of the early period. It is a dialogue that is in part of what could be called the search for a definition. How do we define terms? This is what a philosopher does. They don't look up things in the dictionary. They want to define terms in conversation with the use of interrogation and interpretation. How do we get to the question of what actually is excellence or virtue as it's translated in the text? So Socrates sort of throws Meno off by saying, you want me to say, can virtue be taught? Can it be practiced, or is it innate to all of us? But regardless of those 3 questions, I don't even know what excellence is. So the rest of the dialogue is trying to map out and define what is excellence. And they begin with excellence. He asks Meno, he reverses this to Meno by saying, give me an idea of what you think virtue is or excellence based on your master from the north, Gorgias, who represents the sophist school of thinking, right? The sophist, actually, the defined term here, is someone who can argue for argument's sake. This was a group of itinerant philosophers who went from town to town giving lessons to the richer families, mainly the children of the richer families, to breed them, if you will, or to, basically give them the capabilities, if you will, of arguing politically the best way. So they were really experts in argumentation, but never argumentation in the name of searching, as the idealist does, for the truth of the matter or towards a dialectical interpretation of things. They were looking for the best argument only. So we'll speak more about this, the sophist versus the dialectician, as we go forward. So anyway, the dialogue begins between Meno and Socrates. We're going to be engaging this week on the question of, he asks Meno, well, tell me, what is virtue to you? And he gives him a plethora of descriptions of what virtue is. And Socrates is looking for one definition, a universal there. It's a quest for a universal definition of what excellence is. And again, please follow me. I'm using excellence and virtue interchangeably. I like the translation of arete better, excellence, than virtue, but most of the books use virtue. So I'm going to use those terms interchangeably. So anyway, going back to this, he asked Meno about this, and we have analogies. To the bee swarm, you ask me for one, but you give me many, many bees, many varying definitions of virtue, a plethora. That's not the way to go about going to the definition. And then he draws the analogy, of course, to color, right? Later on, and this is the second analogy in the text. And this is going on again. The introduction is, if I can give you line numbers or page numbers in the Hackett edition, pages 59 is where the dialogue actually begins, and we're going to begin to talk more about this, the whole swarm of ideas on page 61. And, Meno describes this and I'll use pagination in the side, which is the Greek pagination. 71e is when Meno gives many definitions, and Socrates confronts him this. You can begin to see how Socrates operates in this. So anyway, many virtues, and then shape and color are then going on as well. Is it a virtue or not? We will encounter this, but I want to, sensitize you to this. But the first movement of the dialogue begins from 70a up to 81e, which 81e is on page 71. So I want you to really look at this, the questions, of being taught, being practiced, and is it innate, and how this is interwoven into the text. And then secondly, the definitions, first, that knowledge is excellence, and how Socrates tries to undo that, and then that excellence is justice. 80a to 81e is 80a actually begins, if you will, the second part of the dialogue, where Socrates then is described as the stingray, and this is happening descriptively on page 70 of the text. And I'll read you this section, and we'll pick this up tomorrow on Tuesday class, and also on Thursday. Socrates, this begins actually on page 69. 80 is the line number. Before I even met you, I used to hear that you were always in a state of perplexity, of confusion, that you bring others to the same state, and now think you are bewitching and beguiling me, simply putting me under a spell, and so that I am quite perplexed. Indeed, if a joke is in order, you seem in appearance and in every other way to be like the broad torpedo fish, for it too makes anyone who comes close and touches it feel numb. So Socrates is analogized by Meno to be like a stingray or a torpedo fish, right? Now you seem to have that kind of effect on me, for both my mind and my tongue are numb, and I have no answer to give you. Yet I have made many speeches about virtue before large audiences on thousands of occasions, very good speeches, as I thought. But now I can't even say what it is. I think you were wise not to sail away from Athens to go elsewhere, but if you were to behave like this in a stranger in another city, you'd be driven away for practicing sorcery. So he's called both a stingray and a sorcerer, someone that, is able to beguile, hypnotize, and as well numb and silence someone else that thinks they know what they know. And then Socrates replies, "You are a rascal, Meno. You have nearly deceived me. Why so particularly? I know who drew this image, why you drew this image." He says, "I want to draw an image of you." So he confronts this by talking about the handsome one. So anyway, then they go on to this argument about seeking and finding, and we're going to begin there on Tuesday and take it up on Thursday. How does one seek something when they don't know what they're looking for? Or if they already know what they're looking for, why go to the trouble to do the discovery or the journey? So this is a good question that he asks about, called the debater's argument you're bringing up, that a man cannot search either for what he knows or for what he does not know. He cannot search for what he knows, since he knows it. There's no need to look. Nor for what he does not know, for he does not know what to look for. So we're going to be talking about this in terms of philosophical questioning and path building. Okay, so thank you. I'll try to make these very concise each week. I think we have a good start, and I hope it works. So thank you so much, and I'll see you in class on Tuesday.